Imagine walking into a place where time stands still, where the last human touch was 4,600 years ago. This is Wadi el-Jarf.
If you were asked who invented paper, the pub quiz answer would be China.
Oh, I know this one.
So I first heard about this place back in 2019 when I was on a trip in the Sinai Peninsula with French archaeologist Pierre Tallet. During a break, we were just chatting about what he was doing then, which was digging on a very different site over the Red Sea in Wadi el-Jarf. He told me about the discovery there of walking into a gallery that had just been left by Egyptian workmen 4,600 years ago and not been visited since. He described the remnants of the boats, tools just lying against the wall, rope that had fallen on the floor and was just left there, waiting all these thousands of years for the next person to walk through, and that was Pierre and his team. Ever since hearing about this site, I'd been desperate to see it for myself, to really see somewhere where time is collapsed and you feel connected through everyday objects to people so long ago. Of course, COVID got in the way, so it wasn't until 2022 that I finally got to walk on this site amongst the many hundreds of thousands of pottery shards that the team had discovered by then after digging for a decade. It was a vast jigsaw puzzle, probably the biggest in the world, with no box to guide the assembly or even any assurance that all the pieces were still there. And yet that was the task of Seferine Masha. I met her in the office where she was painstakingly gluing some of these shards back together to show the beautiful water jars they had once been. This is where Pierre showed me some of the treasures the site had yielded. He first brought out a scrap of what looked like cotton, held between two panes of glass to keep it clean and safe. And he handed it to me. And I stared at it, at first not really understanding the significance. It just looked like any sort of rag torn from a piece of clothing. But it slowly came into focus. What it is the earliest paper ever discovered, earlier than the earliest Chinese version we have by 1,000 years. The first documentation of this site that we have was from Sir John Gardner from a visit in 1823, which he documented in his notebooks, which are really hard to read. I've seen the reproductions and I actually couldn't make head or tail of them, but luckily other scholars have persevered. He misidentified them as Greco-Roman catacombs.
I do believe that these are Greco-Roman catacombs.
Now, they do have the overall shape of catacombs, but they were filled with dirt, so he wasn't to know there weren't actually any skeletons in them. It took until the 1950s for the site to be more systematically researched, and that was by two amateur archaeologists who were boat pilots working for the Suez Canal Company. They dated the site far more accurately, back to the Old Kingdom, though they did get the dynasty wrong. But their investigations were cut short by the 1956 Suez Canal crisis, and the site fell back into obscurity. Until 2008, when a certain archaeology PhD student, Gregory Marois, was using Google Earth to identify sites across Egypt. He knew about the galleries from these earlier historical sources, so he zoomed in on it and found them, but he found something else that none of the previous archaeologists had identified at all. It was a huge installation, in fact, the biggest ancient Egyptian installation on the Red Sea coast, yet they'd somehow managed to miss it. But Google Earth satellites could see the tops of the walls of this huge structure, which we now know to be the living quarters of the workmen who dug out the galleries. Despite the clear importance of the site, it was 3 years before Pierre Tallet got funding to excavate properly. But they finally started in 2011, and then came a stroke of good luck, because they visited the shore of the Red Sea near this massive installation at a very particular time. It was low tide combined with a full moon, and so it was lower than normal. And this meant the full ancient harbour was in full view. So they'd identified the harbour in their first season of excavating. They knew where the installation was, and the work to do was to dig. And this is where the site yielded treasure after treasure. While they were digging out one of the galleries, they moved the entrance stone, and there, right in front, in a huge pit, was a massive tranche of papyri that had lain undisturbed for all these thousands of years, just plugged up with these enormous stones that were sealing the gallery. Because there is no damp, there was no damage, and because the Egyptians are so good at sealing, there was no interference from mites or dust. And so these papyri, seemingly just chucked away, were entirely legible if you know hieroglyphics, which Pierre does. They turned out to be meticulous logbooks of the time that the pyramids of Giza were built. And they were records of all the construction, labour, work that were necessary to build the pyramids. They turned out to be the logbooks of the site inspector, Merer, who recorded meticulously all the detail of his project, mining for the Great Pyramids of Giza. Unusually for this very bureaucratic society, he just tossed them away in this big pit, perhaps because of the haste in leaving the site, to be picked up by Tallet and his team all these thousands of years later. These logbooks recorded all the logistics, including all the names of the workers and how much they worked. When they were mining for the pyramids of Khufu, the famous pyramids at Giza, that are a long way away, it records the immense effort required to build these pyramids, down to very tiny details. So what is paper? It's actually just a different method of making the material that we write on. More common in Egypt was papyrus, which is made from the plant papyrus, which grows plentifully down the Nile, making it a very cheap material. It's essentially a bit like grass, but the leaves are far, far fatter, something like this. And what they did was weave the leaves together and then dry it out and press it and dry it and press and dry it and press until it was, and it made it very flexible because it was made out of fibres. Paper is made entirely differently. The whole object is to break those fibres down, whether it's made from wood or cotton or any other fibre. Originally, it was made from the bark of mulberry trees in China. We're not quite sure yet what this sample is made from. But you strip the fibres apart and then you boil them in a big soup to break down all the cellulose, because then it's squashed into more like a felted material. And the water is all pressed out, and it makes it ultimately smoother to write on because there aren't those fibres running through.
After more than a decade, the excavation is still incomplete, and lab work to examine the material continues. Yet the documents and objects found in this long neglected site on the periphery have already upended many established historical narratives. Who knows what else still lies in the desert, dormant and secretive, waiting to be found. This was New Lines in Focus. If you enjoyed it, please let us know in the comments which New Lines essay from newlinesmag.com you would like to see in focus.